They say hell is other people. But in the autumn of 1862, hell was a single man moving through the Arkansas backcountry like smoke through trees. 15 bounty hunters entered the wilderness to bring him back in chains. Not one of them saw home again. Not one of them understood what they were hunting until it was far too late. This is the story of Bass Reeves, a name that plantation owners learned to whisper rather than speak aloud. A man who transformed from property into predator, who turned the tools of his bondage into instruments of liberation, and who proved that the most dangerous animal is the one that has nothing left to lose. But to understand how one man could accomplish what seems impossible, we need to go back. Back to a world where human beings were bought and sold like livestock, where the color of your skin determined whether you lived as a person or died as property, and where the machinery of slavery ground countless lives into dust beneath its wheels. The Red River Valley in southwestern Arkansas was cotton country, rich alluvial soil that produced crops so valuable that men built empires on the backs of those they enslaved. In 1860, Miller County alone held over 200 plantations, each one a kingdom unto itself, ruled by white owners who believed themselves civilized while practicing barbarism as a business model. Among these plantations, the Thornton estate stood out. Not the largest, that distinction belonged to the Mackenzie holdings to the north, but certainly among the most profitable. Marcus Thornton had inherited the land from his father and expanded it through calculated marriages and ruthless business practices. By 1860, he owned 4,000 acres, 300 enslaved people, and enough political influence to ensure that local laws bent in his favor. The Thornton plantation operated like a small city. Cotton fields stretched to the horizon, broken only by timber lots where enslaved men felled trees for lumber shipments down the Red River. The main house rose 3 stories, white columns gleaming in the sun, a monument to wealth built on suffering. Behind it, the slave quarters spread in concentric circles, housing arranged by value, with skilled craftsmen closest to the main house and field hands relegated to the outer rings. In the blacksmith shop on the eastern edge of the compound, that's where you'd find Bass. The records are sparse. Plantation ledgers list his purchase in 1855 from a broker in Nashville. Price paid, $1,200. Age, approximately 27. Previous owner, deceased. Skills, blacksmithing, farrier work, carpentry. The notation in the margin, written in Marcus Thornton's own hand, reads, "Exceptionally strong. Quiet disposition. Previous owner's widow eager to sell." Inquire why. Thornton apparently never inquired deeply enough. Or perhaps he did, and decided that whatever darkness lived in Bass's past was safely buried. Either way, it was a miscalculation that would eventually cost him everything. Bass stood 6 feet and 3 inches tall in an era when the average man barely reached 5'8". His frame suggested coiled wire rather than bulk, the kind of strength that came from years of swinging a hammer, of working metal until it bent to your will. His face revealed nothing, eyes that looked at you without really seeing you, or perhaps seeing too much and choosing to show none of it. The other enslaved people on the Thornton plantation gave him space. Not from fear exactly, but from an instinctive recognition that Bass existed somewhere outside the normal boundaries of their world. He didn't join the evening gatherings where people sang to forget their circumstances. He didn't participate in the quiet rebellions, the deliberately broken tools, the work slowdowns, the whispered plans for escape that usually ended in capture and punishment. He simply worked. Day after day, year after year, working metal in the forge. And while he worked, he watched. What Bass saw during those 7 years would have broken most men. The Thornton plantation practiced what Marcus called scientific management, a system that reduced human beings to variables in an efficiency equation. Punishment was calculated not for correction but for maximum deterrent effect. When a field hand was caught stealing food, the whipping happened at noon when everyone could witness it. When a woman tried to run, they brought her back and put her in the stocks for 3 days as a lesson to the others. Bass watched it all with those expressionless eyes. And something inside him, already damaged by whatever had happened in Tennessee, grew colder and harder with each passing season. The blacksmith work gave him advantages that field hands never had. Access to tools, knowledge of how locks worked, how chains could be broken, how metal could be shaped into weapons if you knew what you were doing. The white overseers who supervised him saw a valuable slave performing necessary work. They didn't see a man cataloging every weakness in their security, memorizing the rotation of night patrols, noting which guards drank themselves stupid and which ones stayed alert. Bass had learned the essential truth of survival in bondage. You become what they need you to be on the surface, while keeping your real self buried so deep that no amount of whipping or degradation can reach it. He played the role of the compliant craftsman so perfectly that Marcus Thornton bragged about him to neighboring planters. Best blacksmith in 3 counties, he'd say. Never gives trouble, produces excellent work. That's what proper management achieves. Thornton had no idea he was boasting about a man who spent every waking moment planning his death. The American Civil War erupted in April 1861, and its shockwaves reached even the remote plantations of Arkansas. Young white men marched off to fight for the Confederacy, singing songs about honor and Southern rights. What they were really fighting for, though everyone knew but few admitted, was the right to keep people like Bass in chains. The war changed everything on the Thornton plantation. With so many white men gone to fight, security became a skeleton crew. The overseers who remained were either too old or too infirm for military service, or they were the kind of men who valued their own skin too much to risk it in battle. The patrol schedules became erratic. The discipline that Marcus Thornton prided himself on began to crack, and Bass watched those cracks with the attention of a man who'd been waiting 7 years for exactly this opportunity. By the fall of 1862, the plantation was running on momentum and fear. Marcus Thornton traveled frequently to Little Rock and Shreveport, conducting business that kept his operation afloat while the war strangled Southern commerce. His absences grew longer. The overseers grew more nervous. The enslaved population began to whisper about freedom, about Union armies in the North, about the possibility that the world they'd been born into might actually end. Bass didn't whisper. He prepared. On October 28, 1862, Marcus Thornton announced he was traveling to Texarkana for a meeting with other plantation owners. The journey would take 3 days. He needed a blacksmith to come along to handle any wagon repairs and assist with purchasing new equipment. Bass was the obvious choice, skilled, reliable, and as Thornton had said many times, never gave trouble. The decision to bring Bass on that trip was the last mistake Marcus Thornton would ever make. They left at dawn on a Tuesday, the wagon loaded with cotton samples and correspondence for merchants in Texas. Thornton rode on the bench with his rifle across his knees. Bass sat in the back among the cargo, hands visible, posture submissive. Just another piece of property being transported for his owner's convenience. But inside Bass's head, a clock had started counting down. 7 years of watching, learning, and waiting were about to convert into action. Every mile that carried them away from the plantation took them closer to the moment when property would transform into a person, and a person into something the South had never seen before. The journey to Texarkana covered 35 miles of rough road through pine forests and creek bottoms. They stopped twice for rest, and Bass performed exactly as expected, tending the horses, unloading supplies, speaking only when spoken to. Thornton relaxed as the miles passed. Why wouldn't he? This slave had never shown a hint of rebellion in 7 years. They reached Texarkana on Wednesday evening and took rooms at a boarding house near the courthouse. Thornton secured his room. Bass slept in the stable with the horses, as was customary. Alone in the darkness, surrounded by the smell of hay and horse sweat, Bass didn't sleep. He lay motionless, running through sequences in his mind. Timing, distance, force required. Escape routes, every variable considered, every possibility calculated. Thursday morning, Thornton conducted his business while Bass remained with the wagon in the town square. People passed by, merchants, soldiers, women with children. None of them looked twice at the tall slave standing beside his master's property. Why would they? The entire economy of the South depended on scenes exactly like this. Enslaved people standing quietly while white people went about their business. What none of them understood was that they were watching a bomb count down to detonation. The moment came at 2 in the afternoon. Thornton emerged from a merchant's office, papers in hand, satisfied expression on his face. He walked toward the wagon, already thinking about the journey home, about the deals he'd made, about the security of his position in a world he believed would last forever. Bass stood beside the wagon, waiting. Thornton reached for the wagon bench, and Bass moved. 7 years of blacksmith work had taught Bass everything about leverage, about force, about how to strike metal to achieve exactly the result you wanted. He'd spent countless hours imagining this moment, visualizing it with such intensity that when it finally came, his body moved with mechanical precision. The hammer was in the wagon bed. Heavy iron head on a hickory handle, a tool Bass had used 10,000 times. He grabbed it and swung in one continuous motion, no hesitation, no wasted energy. The hammer connected with the side of Marcus Thornton's skull with a sound like a melon splitting. Thornton dropped. Not dramatically, just down, his legs folding, his papers scattering in the dirt. Bass didn't wait to see if he was dead. He vaulted onto the wagon bench, grabbed the reins, and had the horses moving before the first scream erupted from a witness on the street. By the time people started running toward the fallen plantation owner, Bass had the horses at a gallop, heading east out of town on the road that led into deep timber country. Behind him, chaos erupted in Texarkana. A slave had attacked his master in broad daylight. The alarm bell started ringing. Men grabbed weapons. The machinery of slave control began grinding into motion. That terrifying system designed to crush any hint of rebellion before it could spread. What they didn't understand yet was that Bass wasn't running in panic or desperation. He was executing a plan he'd refined over 7 years. And the 15 men who would soon start hunting him were about to learn a lesson written in blood and silence. The road east from Texarkana cut through dense pine forest that had stood for centuries. Bass drove the horses hard for the first 3 miles, then pulled off onto a logging track barely visible through the underbrush. He abandoned the wagon there, took only what he needed, a knife from the tool chest, rope, a canvas sack with dried meat Thornton had purchased, and disappeared into the timber. Behind him, the pursuit was organizing with the efficiency of long practice. This wasn't the first time a slave had run from Miller County. The system for recapture was well established, refined over decades of crushing desperate people who'd tried for freedom. Within 2 hours of Bass's escape, a hunting party was forming. The man who assembled that party was named William Garrett, and his reputation stretched across 3 states. Garrett had been catching runaway slaves for 15 years. He owned 7 dogs trained specifically for tracking humans. He carried a modified shotgun that fired small shot designed to maim rather than kill. After all, dead slaves couldn't be returned for reward money. His success rate was perfect. Every slave he'd pursued had been brought back, broken in body and spirit, to face their owner's punishment. Garrett charged premium rates. $50 base fee, plus expenses, plus a percentage of the slave's value. For a skilled blacksmith like Bass, worth over $1,000, the math was simple. Whoever caught him could expect a payment of at least $200, equivalent to 6 months' wages for a working man. By sunset on Thursday, Garrett had assembled 14 other men. Some were professional slave catchers like himself. Others were plantation overseers, skilled in tracking and violence. A few were opportunistic bounty hunters drawn by the money. All of them were experienced, armed, and confident. They had no idea they were about to enter a slaughterhouse. Garrett divided his force into 3 groups of 5 men each, keeping himself in the center group. The northern team would sweep along the Sulphur River. The southern team would check known slave hideouts and safe houses. Garrett's group would follow the most direct eastern route, the path any rational fugitive would take toward Union territory. It was sound tactical thinking. It would have worked against a normal runaway, someone fleeing in panic, making decisions driven by fear and desperation. But Bass wasn't normal, and he wasn't fleeing. He was hunting. The first body was discovered on Saturday morning, November 1st, 1862. A farmer checking his traps found it in a ravine 2 miles north of the main road. The dead man's name was Jacob Pruitt, part of the Northern Search Team. He'd been separated from his group the previous evening while following what he thought was Bass's trail. The coroner's report, preserved in Miller County records, describes the cause of death with clinical precision: manual strangulation, severe trauma to throat and neck, signs of struggle. Deceased's weapons missing, including rifle, pistol, and hunting knife. What the report didn't capture was the positioning. Pruitt's body had been arranged deliberately, placed where the next searcher would find it. Arms spread wide, eyes open, staring at the sky. A message written in flesh: "This is what happens when you hunt me." William Garrett examined the scene personally. He was too experienced to miss the implications. The positioning suggested calculation rather than panic. The efficiency of the kill indicated someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And the missing weapons meant Bass was now armed. Garrett sent a rider back to Texarkana with a request for additional men and better equipment. Then he made a decision that would haunt the remainder of his brief life. He decided to continue the pursuit immediately, before Bass could gain more distance. It was exactly what Bass wanted him to do. The second and third deaths occurred on Sunday. 2 men from the Southern search team, hunting together for safety, failed to return to their evening rendezvous point. Their bodies were found on Monday morning, both strangled, both positioned where they'd be discovered. The pattern was unmistakable now. Bass wasn't avoiding his pursuers. He was systematically eliminating them. The realization spread through the remaining hunters like poison. These were hard men, accustomed to violence, experienced in tracking dangerous quarry. But they'd always been the predators. Now they were prey, and the psychological reversal was devastating. 3 men quit outright, riding back to Texarkana and refusing to continue regardless of the money offered. Garrett cursed them for cowards but couldn't stop them. That left 12 hunters, counting himself. 12 men to pursue one fugitive slave, who'd somehow transformed into the most efficient killer Miller County had ever seen. What the hunters didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that Bass had spent 7 years preparing for exactly this scenario. Every night on the Thornton plantation, lying in his cabin while other enslaved people slept, Bass had run scenarios in his mind. If I escape, they'll send hunters, dogs, men with guns. How do I survive? How do I win? The answer he'd reached was simple and terrible. You don't run from predators. You become a more efficient predator. Bass knew these woods. Not from personal experience, he'd never been allowed to roam freely, but from careful listening over 7 years. Enslaved people traveled between plantations carrying messages, visiting spouses on neighboring properties. They saw things, heard things, and in the quiet moments they shared information. Bass had listened to all of it, building a mental map of the territory, identifying water sources, shelter locations, game trails, and most importantly, the routes that hunters would logically follow. Now he was using that knowledge with lethal efficiency. The 4th death broke William Garrett's nerve. It happened on Tuesday, November 4th. One of Garrett's own team, a man named Thomas Birch, stepped away from camp to relieve himself. 30 yards from the fire, within shouting distance of 4 other armed men, and he simply vanished. They found him at dawn. Strangled like the others, but this time with evidence that Bass had been watching the camp for hours. Marks in the soft ground showed where he'd lain in concealment, close enough to hear conversations, observing their routines and waiting for the perfect moment. Garrett called his remaining men together. 9 hunters now, plus himself, 10 men pursuing 1 fugitive and losing. The dogs had proven useless. Bass moved through water when possible, used tricks to mask his scent, and the one time the hounds got close, they'd been found poisoned the next morning with meat laced with something that killed them in convulsions. We're being picked off, Garrett told his men, stating the obvious that everyone was thinking. He's not running scared. He's executing a campaign against us. One of the men, a plantation overseer named Samuel Hook, asked the question they were all wondering. How? He's 1 slave, no training, no experience. How is he doing this? Garrett didn't have an answer. How could he explain that some men are born with a capacity for violence that only needs opportunity to manifest? That 7 years of silent observation had taught Bass everything he needed to know about his enemies. That desperation combined with intelligence creates something far more dangerous than either quality alone. The hunters decided to change tactics. Instead of spreading out to cover more ground, they'd stay together as one unit, move more slowly, more carefully, with constant vigilance. It was an admission of fear, a recognition that they were no longer the predators in this scenario. It wouldn't save them. Bass watched from a ridge 300 yards away as the hunters reorganized. He'd been paralleling their movement for 2 days, staying close enough to observe but far enough to remain invisible. He saw them cluster together, saw the fear in their body language, and understood immediately what it meant. They were making themselves a harder target. But they were also making themselves predictable. The 5th and 6th deaths happened simultaneously on Wednesday night. The hunters had made camp in a defensive position, backs to a rock outcropping, fire in the center, sentries posted at intervals. Professional precautions that should have kept them safe. But Bass didn't attack the camp. He waited until full dark, when the sentries were fighting exhaustion and the fire had burned low. Then he started making sounds in the darkness. Breaking branches, rattling bushes, the sounds of something, or someone, moving through the forest just beyond the edge of visibility. 2 men went to investigate. Garrett tried to stop them, but they'd been on edge for days, jumping at shadows, and the sounds promised a target they could actually see and shoot. They found Bass's preparations instead. He'd rigged a deadfall trap, a technique he'd learned from listening to men who'd hunted in Indian territory. A heavy log suspended by rope, triggered by a tripwire stretched across the game trail. Both men hit the wire simultaneously. The log swung down with crushing force. The screams brought the others running. By the time they reached the trap, Bass was gone, and 2 more of their number were dead. Crushed skulls. More weapons acquired. The hunter's arsenal was steadily arming the man they were trying to capture. William Garrett made the hardest decision of his life that night. He called off the hunt. 8 men remained alive from the original 15, and Garrett's perfect record of never losing a fugitive meant nothing compared to surviving. They would return to Texarkana, report what had happened, and let someone else deal with Bass Reeves. It was a reasonable decision. A sensible decision. And it came one day, too late. Thursday morning, November 6th, the 8 surviving hunters broke camp and started west toward civilization. They traveled close together, weapons ready, eyes scanning the forest constantly. Every shadow was a threat. Every sound was Bass preparing another attack. They made 5 miles before Bass struck again. He'd circled ahead of them during the night, moving with the silence of smoke, and positioned himself at a creek crossing that the hunters would have to use. The water was shallow, but the banks were steep, requiring the men to descend single file. A natural choke point, a place where their numerical advantage disappeared. Bass waited in the brush on the far side, utterly still, barely breathing. He'd wedged himself into a hollow beneath a fallen tree, covered with leaves and branches until he was invisible 5 feet away. And he watched as the hunters approached the crossing. William Garrett went first, rifle raised, eyes sweeping the far bank. He saw nothing, signaled for the others to follow. Started across. Bass let him pass, let the second man pass. Waited until 3 men were on the far bank and the remaining 5 were descending to the water. Then he moved. The details of what happened next come from the sole survivor, a man named Robert Yancey, whose testimony was recorded by the county sheriff 3 days later. Yancey's account describes chaos, sudden violence erupting from nowhere, Bass appearing from concealment like a demon, moving with speed that seemed impossible for a man his size. The first 2 men died before they could raise their weapons. Bass used the knife he'd taken from Jacob Pruitt, the first hunter he'd killed. Throat cuts, fast and efficient, arterial blood spraying. The third man got his rifle up, but Bass was already inside his guard, close enough that the gun was useless. And then the man was choking on his own crushed windpipe. The hunters, still in the creek bed, panicked. Started shooting, but Bass was already moving, using the bodies as cover, staying low, and the bullets punched into dead flesh or whistled harmlessly through the space where he'd been a heartbeat before. Garrett died trying to reload. Hook died running. The others scattered into the forest in pure animal panic, and Bass let them go. For now, he knew they'd slow down eventually, exhausted. He could find them later. But Robert Yancey, terrified and half-mad with shock, ran without stopping until he reached the main road, flagged down a wagon, got to Texarkana by nightfall, and told his story to anyone who'd listen. 13 men dead. 13 professional hunters, experienced trackers, armed and organized, killed by one escaped slave in less than a week. The news spread through Miller County like wildfire, and the reaction wasn't what you might expect. People were terrified. But underneath the terror was something else, something the white population couldn't quite acknowledge but felt deep in their bones. It was the recognition that everything they'd told themselves about the people they enslaved, that they were inferior, docile, incapable of the intelligence and violence that white men possessed, had just been proven catastrophically wrong. One man had shattered the comfortable lie at the heart of slavery. And if one man could do this, what did that say about the 300,000 enslaved people in Arkansas alone? What did it say about the 4 million held in bondage across the South? The authorities in Texarkana faced an impossible choice: send more men after Bass and risk additional deaths, or admit they couldn't catch one fugitive and face the psychological consequences of that admission. In the end, they chose a third option. They sent for military help. Confederate soldiers, men with actual combat training, to hunt down Bass Reeves and end the nightmare he'd created. It was a decision that would lead to even greater horror, because Bass wasn't finished. Not even close. Captain Marcus Whitfield arrived in Texarkana on November 9th with 23 Confederate soldiers. Veterans of actual combat, men who'd fought at Wilson's Creek and Pea Ridge, who'd seen the elephant, as they said, face death and dealt it out in return. These weren't civilian slave catchers or plantation overseers playing at being soldiers. These were hardened fighters who'd survived the meat grinder of Civil War combat. Whitfield was a professional. Before the war, he'd served with the Army in Texas, fighting Comanche raiders who were considered among the most formidable warriors on the continent. He'd learned tracking from Apache scouts, had studied military tactics at West Point, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd faced the worst humanity could offer and come out intact. He listened to Robert Yancey's testimony with a skeptical expression that gradually shifted to concern as the details accumulated. 13 men dead, professional hunters, experienced trackers, all killed by one fugitive slave using nothing but improvised weapons and wilderness skills. "You're telling me," Whitfield said slowly, "that this man has conducted what amounts to a guerrilla campaign against pursuers for over a week? Using ambush tactics, psychological warfare, and strategic positioning?" Yancey nodded, still shaking from his experience. "He's not human, Captain. He's a devil. He was everywhere and nowhere. We'd think we were tracking him and then he'd be behind us. We'd set guards and he'd kill men within earshot of the camp. He's a ghost." Whitfield didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in training, tactics, and the application of superior force. But he also believed in taking threats seriously, and a man who'd killed 13 pursuers was a threat that required military response. "Where are the other survivors?" he asked. "Dead," Yancey whispered. "I'm the only one left. The others who ran from the creek. Bass hunted them down over the next 2 days. Found their bodies scattered through the woods. All strangled, all positioned where we'd find them. He wanted us to know. Wanted us to be afraid." Whitfield organized his soldiers with the precision of a career officer. He divided them into 3 squads of 7 men each, with established communication protocols and defensive procedures. They would move through the search area systematically, maintaining sight contact between squads, establishing fortified camps each night. No more small groups. No more opportunities for Bass to pick off isolated targets. It was exactly the kind of methodical professional approach that should have worked. And it might have if Bass had stayed in the area. But Bass was already gone. While Whitfield organized his military manhunt, Bass was 30 miles east, moving steadily toward the Arkansas-Louisiana border. He'd accomplished what he needed to accomplish. Killed enough hunters that the message was clear. Pursuing him meant death. Acquired enough weapons that he could defend himself if cornered. And most importantly, bought enough time that the initial pursuit had broken down into disorganization and fear. Now it was time to disappear. Bass traveled at night and hid during the day, using techniques he'd learned from 7 years of careful listening to men who'd attempted escape before him. He avoided roads and settlements, moving through deep timber and swamp country where few white people ventured. He rationed the food he'd taken, supplemented it with what he could catch or gather, and showed the same patience that had characterized his years in bondage. But patience didn't mean he'd stopped being dangerous. The 14th death occurred on November 12th, 50 miles from where Whitfield's soldiers were searching. The victim's name was Daniel Coopersmith, a slave catcher who worked independently, tracking fugitives for bounty money. Coopersmith had heard about Bass and the reward that had climbed to $500, a fortune that could set a man up for life. He'd also heard that Bass was moving east, and Coopersmith knew the territory along the border better than anyone. He found Bass's trail on November 11th, signs that someone was moving through the wilderness, avoiding settlements, traveling with purpose. Coopersmith followed those signs with the confidence of a man who'd caught 47 runaways over his career. He caught up with Bass at a creek crossing on a cold morning when fog hung in the trees like shrouds. Bass was filling his canteen, apparently unaware of being followed. Coopersmith raised his rifle, sighted on Bass's back, and prepared to fire a wounding shot that would disable but not kill. Bass turned and smiled. Coopersmith realized in that frozen moment that Bass had known he was there, had led him here deliberately, had positioned himself perfectly so that when Coopersmith focused through his rifle sight, he wouldn't see the rope stretched across the trail at ankle height. Coopersmith triggered the trap himself, stumbling forward, and Bass was already moving. The rifle shot went wild. Coopersmith tried to bring the gun around, but Bass had crossed 15 feet in the time it took to blink. And then hands like iron vices were around Coopersmith's throat. They found his body 3 days later, positioned beside the trail with his rifle placed across his chest. Another message, another warning. Pursue me and die. The 15th and final death was different, deliberate, personal. A settling of accounts that Bass had been carrying since the moment he'd swung that hammer into Marcus Thornton's skull. Harold Vickers was the head overseer at the Thornton plantation, the man who'd supervised Bass's work, who'd administered punishments, who'd represented the daily machinery of Bass's enslavement. When news of Bass's escape and the subsequent killings reached the plantation, Vickers had done something unexpected. He'd armed himself and ridden east, tracking Bass not for bounty money but for revenge and pride. Vickers was good at his job. He'd been managing enslaved labor for 20 years and had developed instincts about how fugitives thought, where they'd run, what mistakes they'd make. He tracked Bass through northern Louisiana, following cold camps and abandoned shelters, closing the distance with methodical patience. On November 18th, he found Bass's trail leading toward a swamp community where free black people and escaped slaves lived in precarious freedom, protected by difficult terrain and distance from white authority. Vickers positioned himself on the main trail leading to the settlement, certain that Bass would come this way. He was right. What he didn't anticipate was that Bass would see him first. Bass had been approaching the trail carefully, knowing that the route to the settlement was an obvious target for anyone hunting him. He spotted Vickers from 100 yards away, recognized him immediately, and made a decision that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with justice. He could have bypassed Vickers entirely, could have circled around and reached safety without confrontation, but Harold Vickers represented 7 years of daily degradation. 7 years of working under the eyes of a man who saw him as property. 7 years of swallowing rage and showing compliance while calculating the price that would eventually be paid. Bass approached from behind, moving with the silence he'd perfected over the past 2 weeks. Vickers never heard him coming, never had a chance to turn, to fight, to even understand what was happening. One moment he was scanning the trail ahead. The next, Bass's hands were on him and consciousness was fading into darkness. But Bass didn't kill him immediately. As Vickers struggled weakly, Bass leaned close and whispered the only words anyone reported him saying during the entire escape. "You should have let me be." They found Vickers the next day, strangled like the others, positioned on the trail with his whip, the implement he'd used countless times on enslaved backs, coiled neatly beside his body. 15 men. 15 deaths over 3 weeks in November 1862. The number became legendary, whispered in slave quarters across the South, and spoken in hushed tones by white people who'd built their world on the assumption of their own invincibility. Bass reached the swamp settlement on November 19th. The community consisted of roughly 40 people living in cabins built on elevated ground, surviving through fishing, trapping, and small-scale farming. They operated in a legal gray zone, not openly challenging white authority, but existing far enough from it that enforcement was difficult and dangerous. The community's leader, a man named Ezekiel Freeman who'd bought his freedom 20 years earlier, met Bass at the settlement's edge with a rifle held ready but not aimed. "You're the one they're talking about," Freeman said. It wasn't a question. Bass nodded. 15 men dead, 15 who came hunting me. Freeman studied Bass for a long moment, reading something in his eyes that made him lower the rifle. "You can stay 3 days. After that, you need to move on. Union lines are 60 miles northeast. They're taking in fugitives, enlisting them to fight. That's your best chance." Bass stayed 2 days, rested, ate proper food for the first time in weeks, and listened to Freeman and others share information about routes, Union positions, and the changing nature of the war. The Confederacy was bleeding. Union armies were advancing. The institution of slavery was cracking at its foundation. On November 21st, Bass left the settlement before dawn, heading northeast toward freedom. He carried weapons taken from dead hunters, supplies provided by Freeman's community, and knowledge that the world he'd been born into was dying. Behind him. The manhunt continued for another 2 weeks before Captain Whitfield admitted defeat. His military report, preserved in Confederate archives, concluded with brutal honesty. The fugitive known as Bass Reeves has evaded capture despite extensive search operations involving military personnel and civilian trackers. 15 men who pursued him are confirmed dead. The fugitive demonstrated tactical capabilities and ruthless efficiency that suggest either military training or natural aptitude for warfare. Recommend suspension of active pursuit. Resources required to continue search exceed value of recapture. Further pursuit likely to result in additional casualties without reasonable probability of success. It was an admission that had never been made before in Arkansas history. One escaped slave had defeated every attempt to recapture him, killed 15 pursuers, and disappeared into territory where authority couldn't reach. The psychological impact on the white population was devastating. If Bass Reeves could accomplish this, what did it mean for the entire system of slavery? The enslaved population absorbed a different lesson. Whispered it in quarters after dark, sang it in coded spirituals, passed it along the grapevine telegraph that connected plantations across the South. One man had fought and won. One man had proven that the masters weren't invincible. One man had made them afraid. Bass reached Union lines on November 28, 1862, and enlisted in the 3rd United States Colored Troops the same day. The recruiting officer who interviewed him noted in the regimental record, "Refugee from Arkansas, claims to have killed 15 pursuers during escape." The story seems improbable, but subject shows no signs of exaggeration or boastfulness. Speaks very little, demonstrates excellent physical condition and apparent familiarity with weapons. Accepted for service. The Union Army didn't question his past too closely. They needed fighters, especially men who knew the territory and had reason to hate the Confederacy. Bass's silence about his experiences suited everyone fine. The details of what he'd done in Arkansas could remain there, buried in wilderness and whispered rumor, but the silence couldn't hide the truth that was written in Bass's eyes, in the careful way he moved, in the moment of assessment he gave to every person he met. He'd crossed a line that most people never approach, had discovered that he possessed a capacity for violence that was both terrifying and liberating, had learned that he could kill without hesitation, without remorse, without anything but cold calculation. The war would give him plenty of opportunities to use those skills. But the foundation had been laid in the Arkansas wilderness in November 1862, when 15 men learned that hunting a human being carries a price, and that some prey becomes predator when pushed beyond endurance. Bass Reeves served in the Union Army for 2 years and 4 months. The military records tell a sparse story. Promotions from private to corporal, then to sergeant. Commendations for reconnaissance work. Notes about exceptional marksmanship and tracking abilities. But between those official lines lies a different narrative, one pieced together from letters, diaries, and interviews with soldiers who served alongside him. A private named Joshua Williams, interviewed in 1897 as part of a project documenting Black Civil War veterans, described Bass this way: "He never spoke about what happened before he reached our regiment. Some men, they'd talk about their escapes, about the plantations they left, about the families they'd lost. Bass just stayed quiet, but we all knew his story. 15 men dead, and when you looked at him, really looked at him, you could see it. He'd gone somewhere most of us would never go. Somewhere dark, and he'd brought something back with him. That darkness manifested in Bass's approach to combat. While other soldiers showed hesitation or fear in battle, Bass showed nothing but cold efficiency. He volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, scouting deep into Confederate territory, gathering intelligence behind enemy lines, conducting raids that required moving through hostile populations. Lieutenant named Charles Morton wrote in his journal about a mission in February 1863. Sergeant Reeves returned from reconnaissance, with detailed maps of Confederate positions. When I asked how he'd gotten so close without detection, he simply said he'd watched their patrols until he understood their patterns. The way he said it, no pride, no emotion, reminded me that this man learned his skills by killing 15 hunters who were tracking him. He approaches warfare the same way he approached survival, with absolute focus and ruthless calculation. But Bass's war service revealed something unexpected. Despite his capacity for violence, despite the darkness that Williams and others recognized in him, Bass followed rules. Military discipline, chain of command, the laws of warfare. He adhered to them with the same precision he'd applied to killing his pursuers. It was as if having legitimate authority to fight, having a uniform and a cause, gave structure to the violence that had been unleashed in Arkansas. The contrast was stark. In the wilderness, Bass had been merciless, killing anyone who pursued him without hesitation or restraint. In the Army, he became a model soldier who followed orders, protected his unit, and never exceeded the boundaries of military necessity. It suggested that the 15 deaths in Arkansas weren't the product of a man who enjoyed killing, but rather someone who'd made a cold calculation, freedom or death, and anyone who stood in the way of freedom would pay the price. That calculation changed when the war gave him legal sanction. Then he could channel his capabilities into something resembling justice rather than pure survival. The 3rd United States Colored Troops fought in multiple engagements across Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Bass participated in the Battle of Milliken's Bend, where black soldiers proved their combat effectiveness against Confederate forces who'd been told that slaves couldn't fight. He was at the Siege of Port Hudson, one of the longest sieges in American military history. His service record notes wounds received in action: a bullet grazed across his ribs in July 1863, shrapnel in his shoulder in March 1864, but nothing that kept him from duty for more than a few days. Other soldiers noticed that Bass seemed almost indifferent to danger. Not reckless, never careless, but possessing a kind of fatalism that suggested he'd already survived the worst thing that could happen to him. Everything after escaping slavery was borrowed time, and he spent it with the focus of a man who understood that survival was a skill requiring constant practice. The war ended in April 1865, 4 years of bloodshed that killed 600,000 men and destroyed the institution of slavery that had defined American society since its founding. Bass received his discharge papers on June 22, 1865, along with thousands of other black soldiers who'd fought for their own freedom and won, and then Bass Reeves disappeared from history. The military records end with his discharge. No pension applications, no land grant claims, no correspondence with fellow veterans. It's as if Bass stepped out of the Army and vanished into the chaos of Reconstruction, one more freed person among 4 million trying to build new lives in a shattered nation. But rumors persisted. Stories filtered through the black communities of Arkansas and the Indian Territory to the west. Some claimed Bass had gone to Texas and become a rancher. Others said he'd moved north to Kansas or Missouri. A few whispered that he'd returned to Miller County, to the Thornton plantation, though what he might have done there remained unspoken. The most persistent rumor, the one that gained traction over the years, claimed that Bass became a lawman, that he took his skills, tracking, combat, the ability to read people and situations, and use them to enforce the law in the wild territories where federal authority barely reached. There are tantalizing hints in the historical record. A deputy U.S. Marshal named Bass Reeves served in Indian Territory from the 1870s through the early 1900s. This Bass Reeves arrested over 3,000 criminals during his career. This Bass Reeves killed 14 men in the line of duty, one fewer than the number who died pursuing the escaped slave in 1862. This Bass Reeves was legendary for his tracking abilities, his fearlessness, and his absolute silence about his past before he pinned on a badge. Historians debate whether they're the same person. The Marshal's records claim he was born in Arkansas and freed during the war, but provide no details about his enslaved life or military service. The physical descriptions match: height, build, approximate age. And there's something poetic about the idea that a man who killed to escape slavery would spend decades enforcing the law that eventually recognized his humanity. But whether they're the same Bass Reeves or not, the slave who escaped from the Thornton plantation left a legacy that transcended his individual story. The 15 deaths in Arkansas became legendary in black communities across the South. Parents told their children about the man who fought back and won. Former slaves shared the story as proof that the masters weren't invincible, that resistance was possible, that one person with courage and capability could challenge the entire system. For white Southerners, the story became something they tried desperately to suppress. The official records minimize what happened. Miller County histories from the late 1800s either omit Bass's escape entirely or reduce it to a single sentence about a fugitive who killed several pursuers. The names of the 15 dead men largely disappeared from public memory, their families apparently ashamed that their relatives had fallen to someone they'd been taught to consider inferior. But suppression couldn't erase the truth. The documents existed in scattered archives, military reports, coroner's records, newspaper accounts, letters, and diaries. And in the 1960s and 70s, historians began piecing together the full story of Bass Reeves and the 15 men who died hunting him. What emerged was a narrative that challenged comfortable myths about slavery. The myth that enslaved people were content with their condition. The myth that they lacked the intelligence or capability to resist effectively. The myth that the system of slavery was stable and secure. Bass Reeves proved all of those myths wrong. He demonstrated that silence and compliance could mask preparation. That 7 years of patient observation could transform into deadly efficiency when opportunity arose. That one determined individual could defeat organized pursuit by superior numbers. More importantly, his story revealed the psychology of someone pushed beyond endurance. Bass didn't kill for pleasure or revenge, at least not primarily. He killed because the alternative was returning to bondage, and he decided that death, his own or his pursuers', was preferable to that fate. Every man who died in the Arkansas wilderness made a choice to participate in his recapture, and Bass made them pay for that choice. The moral complexity of that calculation still resonates today. Was Bass a murderer or a freedom fighter? Were the 15 men victims or aggressors? The answer depends on whether you accept the fundamental premise of slavery, that some human beings can be property, or reject it as inherently illegitimate. Bass apparently made his choice long before he swung that hammer into Marcus Thornton's skull. He'd decided that his humanity wasn't negotiable, that freedom was worth any price, and that anyone who stood between him and liberty was an enemy to be eliminated. The 7 years of silent compliance on the Thornton plantation weren't acceptance of his condition. They were preparation for the moment when he could reject it absolutely. The historical suppression of Bass's story wasn't accidental. Southern historians after Reconstruction worked deliberately to minimize accounts of slave resistance, to create a narrative of the Old South where slavery was benevolent and enslaved people were content. Stories like Bass Reeves's didn't fit that narrative. They proved that slavery required constant violence to maintain, that enslaved people hated their condition enough to kill for freedom, and that the supposed superiority of the master class was a lie. So the stories were buried. Files were misfiled. Records went missing. The families of the 15 dead men were told to stay quiet about how their relatives had died. And for a century, Bass Reeves's escape remained known mainly in oral tradition within black communities, a story passed down but not officially acknowledged. The emergence of the full story in recent decades has forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths. Slavery wasn't a peculiar institution or an unfortunate historical quirk. It was a system of organized violence that dehumanized both enslaved and enslaver. It created situations where the only rational response was violence in return. And it generated resistance that the historical record deliberately obscured. Bass Reeves represents countless others whose stories were never recorded or were actively suppressed. How many other enslaved people fought back and succeeded? How many others made the same calculation, that freedom was worth killing for, and acted on it? The historical record, written by people invested in maintaining certain narratives, won't tell us. But the silence itself speaks volumes. The story we've explored today, the tale of one man's escape and the 15 deaths that followed, was buried deliberately by those who found it threatening. Hidden in courthouse basements and private collections, scattered across archives that didn't want to acknowledge what their documents revealed. The work of recovering this history, of piecing together the truth from fragments, continues today. Here on The Sealed Room, we believe that the stories deliberately hidden are often the ones most worth telling. The narratives that make us uncomfortable, that challenge our assumptions about history and human nature, that force us to confront the violence and resistance that shaped our world. Bass Reeves's story is one of those narratives, dark, brutal, morally complex, and absolutely essential to understanding the reality of slavery and the human capacity for both oppression and resistance. If this story has affected you, if you're sitting there thinking about what you would have done in Bass's position, what choices you'd make when facing the same impossible calculation, you're not alone. This is the power of buried history. It forces us to confront questions we'd rather avoid. Would you comply or resist? Would you survive or fight back? Would you kill to be free? Bass Reeves answered those questions with 15 bodies left in the Arkansas wilderness. And while we might debate his methods, we can't deny the fundamental truth his story reveals, that human beings will do extraordinary, terrible, necessary things when pushed to the absolute limit. Share this video with someone who needs to hear the story, someone who thinks they understand slavery from textbooks and sanitized histories, someone who needs to confront the reality of what that system did to human beings and what they did to survive it. Hit that like button if you believe these buried stories deserve to be told. And subscribe because we're not done uncovering the histories that powerful people tried to hide. The Bass Reeves, who escaped from Miller County in 1862, may or may not be the same Bass Reeves who became a legendary lawman in Indian Territory. The historical record doesn't give us certainty, but both men, whether one person or two, embodied the same truth, that capability, courage, and deadly competence exist independent of skin color, social status, or the labels that society tries to impose. 15 men entered the Arkansas wilderness believing they were hunting property. They died learning they were hunting a human being who decided his humanity wasn't subject to negotiation. That's the lesson their deaths taught, the message written in blood and silence across the autumn landscape of 1862. And perhaps that's why the story was buried so deliberately, hidden in archives and suppressed in official histories, because it proved something that slavery's defenders couldn't afford to acknowledge, that the people they enslaved were exactly as human as they were. Capable of the same intelligence, the same planning, the same ruthless efficiency when survival demanded it. Bass Reeves disappeared after the war, but his legacy remained. In every whispered story in slave quarters, in every moment of resistance, small or large, that his example inspired, in every person who heard about the 15 deaths and understood that the system wasn't invincible, that one determined individual could challenge everything and win. The Arkansas wilderness kept his secrets. The courthouse records minimized what happened. The families of the dead men stayed quiet. But the truth survived in oral tradition, in scattered documents, in the spaces between official histories. And now, over 160 years later, we can finally tell the full story of the man who killed 15 hunters and walked away free. Bass Reeves proved that some debts can only be paid in blood, that freedom isn't given but taken, that compliance and silence can mask preparation for violence, and that the most dangerous person is the one who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The 15 men who died in November 1862 made their choices. Bass Reeves made his, and the world that created those impossible choices, the system of slavery that forced human beings into calculations of violence and survival, was exposed for exactly what it was, a machine of oppression that would eventually destroy itself through the resistance it generated. That's the real story here. Not just one man's escape, but what that escape revealed about the system he fled and the society built upon it. The 15 deaths weren't tragedy or triumph. They were inevitability. When you build a civilization on the premise that some people are property, you create the conditions where those people will eventually fight back with everything they have. Bass Reeves fought back. 15 men died, and the story was buried for over a century because it told a truth that comfortable histories couldn't afford to acknowledge. Now you know what really happened in the Arkansas wilderness in the autumn of 1862. Now you understand why it was hidden. And now you can decide what that story means for how we understand our history and ourselves. The darkness that Bass Reeves carried inside him, the capacity for violence that he discovered and used with such terrible efficiency, exists in all of us. We like to think we're civilized, that we'd never do what he did. But put us in his circumstances, 7 years of bondage, degradation, watching others suffer, knowing that capture meant return to that hell, and we might discover we're capable of exactly the same calculation. That's the final, uncomfortable truth that Bass Reeves' story teaches us. The line between victim and killer, between moral and monstrous, isn't as clear as we pretend. Sometimes survival requires crossing that line. Sometimes being human means doing inhuman things. Sometimes the only way out is through violence that would horrify us in any other context. Bass Reeves understood that, made his peace with it, and disappeared into history, leaving behind 15 bodies and a story that powerful people tried desperately to bury. But stories like this don't stay buried. They resurface. They demand to be told. They force us to confront the realities we'd rather forget. And that's why we're here, telling the stories that were hidden, exploring the darkness that shaped our history, and refusing to accept the comfortable lies that official narratives tried to sell us. Bass Reeves killed 15 men in November 1862. That's a fact. What you do with that fact, how you judge it, what you learn from it, how it changes your understanding of history and human nature, that's up to you. But you can't unhear it now. You can't pretend you don't know. You can't go back to the sanitized version of slavery that erases the violence, the resistance, and the terrible choices that defined that institution. 15 men dead, 1 man free, and a story that survived 160 years of suppression to finally be told in full. That's the power of buried history. It always finds a way out.